It's Easter in the year 1525. The castle and town of Weinsberg, in what is now southern Germany, is under attack. But the army outside the gates is not a foreign invader. Instead, it is a mob of angry German peasants. The peasants managed to force their way in to the town and the castle, overcoming the count and the small number of knights and noblemen that he has defending the area with him. The lady of the castle pleads for her husband's life, but she is bundled, along with her small son, into a manure cart and sent packing to a neighboring town. Her dignity might be damaged, but her life and that of her child will be spared. Her husband, Count Ludwig, will not be so fortunate. The peasants declare that this count will be sentenced to death for the crimes that he has committed against them. And the following morning, he and a number of knights are dragged outside the walls and executed by running the gauntlet. This is a method of execution in which the peasants would line up in two rows facing each other, wielding spears. And one by one, the condemned men would be compelled to run in between the two lines of spear-wielding men. And of course, as they did this, they would be speared continuously from both sides until they dropped dead. As the Count himself staggered through the gauntlet, he heard the angry cries of the peasants ringing in his ears. "You thrust my brother into a dungeon," one cried, "because he did not bare his head as you passed by." "You harnessed us like oxen to the yoke," shouted others. "You caused the hands of my father to be cut off because he killed a hare on his own field. Your horses, dogs, and huntsmen have trodden down my crops. You have wrung the last penny out of us." When all the condemned men had been executed in this way, a peasant woman encouraged her compatriots to grease their spears in the belly fat of the dead nobleman. Drunk on victory, the peasants trampled on the dead bodies of the men who had caused them to live in fear. This episode, sometimes called the Weinsberg Massacre, is a scene from a remarkable series of events that lasted less than a year, from 1524 to 1525. At their peak, they involved hundreds of thousands of people and covered almost all of what is now modern Germany. The event was momentous in many ways. It signaled massive changes in terms of social organization, economics, politics, and religion. You're listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and this is the first of 2 episodes in which we're going to be covering the Peasants War. Now, if you've been listening to my series on the Protestant Reformation, with episodes on Martin Luther and John Calvin, this is going to tie very neatly into that period, because the events that we're going to cover today take place during the life of Martin Luther, and he's heavily involved in this story. So if you haven't already listened to the episode on Luther himself, or if you need a bit of a refresher, now's a good time to go back and revisit that episode. However, if you feel you know a fair amount about Martin Luther, you can jump right in. If you're interested in even more information on this subject, I'll be posting notes on the sources and some of the behind-the-scenes making of this on my Patreon page, and you can find a link to that in the description for these episodes. In the early 1500s, in this period when so many dramatic changes are taking place, including the writings of Martin Luther, which we're going to be hearing a lot about, everyday peasants are still living in an economic system that dates back to the Middle Ages. And the 1500s, depending on which historian you're talking about, isn't really the Middle Ages anymore. It's sometimes called the early modern period. It's post-Renaissance, or maybe mid-Renaissance, depending on which European country you're tracking. So we're not really in the medieval period anymore. However, for many peasants in Germany and other parts of Europe, economically speaking, the Middle Ages are alive and well. And that's because many peasants live in a condition of serfdom. Now, what is a serf? Well, basically, it's a condition that exists in a system called feudalism. And how it works is like this. All the land in a kingdom belongs to the king. The king will parcel out sections of that land to powerful warlords who are loyal to him. They're called nobles, and they get noble titles like count and duke and so on. And so there's an oath or an exchange that goes on between the king and these nobles where he gives them land and they give him an oath of loyalty. And among other things, they promise that when he calls them, they will provide a certain number of men for battle, that they're going to provide revenue, they're going to provide loyalty, and so on. So the king requires the service of these powerful men to keep his kingdom secure. And in exchange, he gives them land. Each of these nobles now has a parcel of land. That is his domain, his estate. It might be even large enough to be called a duchy in some cases. But this nobleman needs to make money off that land. People need to work that land to extract food, wine, and to farm animals on it for animal products that are necessary to survival. So who does that? The answer is serfs. So the serf was the everyday man. He was at the bottom of this pyramid, and he didn't get to own any land. He got to live on a certain allocation of land in an estate owned by a nobleman. The peasants or serfs were required to work the land and serve the nobleman who owned it. This meant farming, of course, but it also included services like repairing farm buildings or keeping the roads in good repair. And they might be asked to perform additional labor by that nobleman at any time. They were allowed to work a small percentage of the land they lived on for their own survival, but most of the crops that they were tilling and watering and weeding and harvesting belonged to the noble lord who owned the land and everything on it. Now, in exchange for this labor, serfs had a place to live, and they were supposed to receive protection from things like criminals and marauders. The nobleman was in charge of security. So, foreign brigands ought not to be riding through there and stealing crops and animals. The nobleman and his band of knights or strongmen were responsible for keeping that area secure. So the deal was service for a place to live and some measure of security, including the provision of justice if these peasants were to suffer wrongdoing at the hands of somebody else. Now, serfdom was often a condition of servitude that was perpetual. Serfs were tied to the land. It wasn't as though you could say, you know what, I don't really like this count. I don't like the way he runs things. I'm just going to pack up my family and go somewhere else to see if I can find a better deal. It wasn't like the modern renting of an apartment in that way. Serfs also had to supply oaths of allegiance to the noblemen that they served, and they were bonded to him in this way. So they were supposed to provide him with obedience and with labor on demand. So there wasn't the ability to just pack up and leave if you didn't like how things were going. Their children were also born into this class, and it was extremely difficult to leave it. So this picture of serfdom as sort of the bottom platform of the feudal pyramid had been going on for centuries. And at this point, in the 1500s, in what is now Germany, it was still the foundation for how many everyday people lived. They labored, they worked the land, and they had to serve the noblemen who owned that land. However, in Germany and other parts of Europe at this time, in the 1500s, there's a shift beginning to happen in the economic conditions of the peasant class. And that shift is away from labor as the rent they have to pay, and towards something that resembles rent that you and I would recognize more readily. And that would be fixed amounts of things like grain, fruit, wine, or farm animals that were payable to the lord at certain fixed times of year. This transition is beginning to happen across Europe, more in some places and less in others, but the conditions under which some peasants are living are beginning to shift away from just labor on demand and towards this more measurable, standardized payment in goods. Of course, peasants would still have to use the mill that was owned by the noble lord to process the grain they harvested even for themselves. I mean, you can't just harvest grain from a field and go directly to eating it. There's a whole process of dehusking and milling and grinding in order to render it down into flour, which you can then use to make bread or whatever else you need. And so typically the nobleman would own the technologies or tools that were required to turn crops into food. And so when the peasants would be harvesting crops, they'd be harvesting most of the crops and handing them over to the nobleman. They might also be operating the mill to process the crops for the nobleman, but if they wanted to use the same mill, as they would have to because there was no other, to process the crops they wanted to eat themselves, they would often have to pay a fee for that. Now, in addition to this, there were other changes afoot. Some nobles were beginning to clear large sections of their land, which previously had been covered in forests. And the reason why they were doing this was sometimes they were involved in starting mining operations, but more commonly, they wanted to start new cities. And so they would clear a section of forest off their enormous estate, and then they would make an offer. They would invite peasants to come and live on that land and to form a new town or a new city. And in order to encourage this to happen, they would offer very specific and attractive terms in order to attract laborers to build such a settlement. So in exchange for paying an annual fee, peasants, merchants, and artisans could come and live in these new cities. They wouldn't be tied to the land in the way that serfs traditionally had been on noble estates. They could use rivers, forests, and lakes surrounding the new city, which were part of the nobleman's estate, as common lands. This was also a new thing, because typically serfs, peasants who were tied to the land, were only allowed to harvest for themselves the part of the land that was allocated for their use, and everything else, including the fish in the streams and the birds of the forest and the wild boar that might be running through the forest, the nobleman owned all of that and you couldn't touch it. In fact, the penalties for harvesting any kind of a wild animal could be incredibly extreme. I mean, peasants have been blinded, castrated, hung, or otherwise mutilated as a penalty for unauthorized harvesting of wild animals or fish, which were part of the noble's land, and they might be right next to the fields that that peasant was working to provide for himself and his family. You might even have wild pigs that were rampaging through that field, ruining your harvest. And if you were a peasant farmer who was a serf, you couldn't touch that wild boar. You were in danger of your life and limb if you did that, because wild animals were the property of the Lord, and typically he was quite fond of hunting them. So you weren't allowed to touch them, even if you and your family were desperately hungry and these wild animals were actively ruining the crops you were planning to eat. So this new deal that some lords are offering, whereby, hey, come and settle in this newly cleared land. It's going to be a new city, and you don't have to work the land for me. You just pay an annual fee. You can build your house. You can live here. You can leave anytime you want. You can fish in the streams. You can use the meadows. This was a much more attractive deal than what most people were used to being offered. And as a result, these new cities were beginning to attract merchants, artisans, and peasant laborers, some of whom were runaways from conditions of serfdom. Some of whom said, you know what, I might be tied to the land and I might have given an oath of loyalty to this lord, but he's really quite a bastard. And I've heard that there's a new city in a neighboring estate over yonder, and I would much rather go there and live under those conditions than live where I am. And so this was a problem, actually, for nobles who kind of had the serf system, as they began to watch some of their laborers disappear to populate these new cities. And they would at times, just like slave owners, try to go and retrieve their serfs. And so nobles who were operating these new cities had a rule. And they said, well, if there's a runaway serf in the new city, and the nobleman comes to retrieve him, he's entitled to retrieve his property, that serf. But if that serf manages to live in this city for a year, then he shall be free, which means the nobleman has no right after that to come and drag him back to the previous estate where he'd been enserfed. So there is a saying that begins to circulate in Germany at this time, which translates as, "The city air makes you free." And the reason I bring this up is that the new cities were not the majority, but there was a significant number of them that were popping up and forming. There were nobles like Frederick the Wise, who was a patron of Martin Luther, who had also built one of these new cities and wanted to build a university there and attract scholars like Luther. And so the fact that these were being formed across Germany and other parts of Europe signaled a change. It signaled new possible ways of organizing society and new terms under which the common man could pursue the conditions of his livelihood. And that was going to change the way most people who weren't living in these new cities viewed their own living conditions, because now there was an alternative. But in addition to having to pay, either in labor or crops, taxes to a noble lord, most everyday people, in fact all of them, were also subjects of the church. And that had an impact in the 1500s that you and I can scarcely imagine. As subjects of the church, it meant that peasants, and indeed everyone, owed 10% of their income as a tithe, or a tax, that was payable to their local church institution. Because peasants worked the land, and they had very little in the way of cash, these tithes were payable in crops. And in many communities, there were enormous tithe barns that stood near monasteries and churches, and these were the buildings in which the tithes of the local community were collected. And you can only imagine how one of these impoverished serf farmers would feel going into one of these massive barns and seeing the aisles piled high with grain, depositing his contribution, and then going home to a meager porridge of barley and vegetables before laying his aching body into bed to drag it out of bed the next day and labor on the lands of his lord. You would think that there would be some resentment. And indeed, there was. The idea was that the peasants were being squeezed by their noble landlords, but they were also under economic pressure by the institutions of the church. And when I say that it's hard for you and I to understand, it's because we live in a post-Reformation age where churches are voluntary local community associations. So if you want to be part of one, then you can go become a member and you can pay your tithe, and maybe you don't pay your tithe, and, you know, perhaps they'll come after you and ask you nicely to pay your contribution, but there aren't really any consequences. People at this period of time didn't have that option. You were a member of the church, whether you liked it or not, and you had to pay your tithe, whether you liked it or not. So the economic pressure was real in a way that you and I are not familiar with. But all of these restrictions, the obligation to provide labor for a noble lord, the payment for land in terms of grain, the tithe payment to your local church, none of this was new. So the question is, why did it explode in such an incredible way in 1524 and 1525? Because the pressures weren't new. There are a number of causes that we can isolate to explain the events that are about to unfold here. First, there was an increase in inflation. So this meant that real wages decreased. And the nobles were anxious to pass this economic burden on to their peasants, which they did by increasing the rent that was due for the land that a peasant would occupy, or by decreasing the amount of land that that peasant would get in exchange for his rent, so that individual plots were smaller and the nobleman could therefore have more rent-paying families on the same amount of the estate that he owned. In addition to this, the nobles were also attempting to reassert ancient privileges that they used to have which had lapsed. So, one of the reasons that they'd lapsed, and one of the reasons why inflation was on the rise, was that Europe was still recovering from the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. And if you listen to our first episode on John Wycliffe, you'll be familiar with that because it exploded in his lifetime. And the incredible effect that it had in terms of decimating the population had extremely long-term results. So even 120 years later, they're still living in the economic shadow of that. So what had happened was things had gotten better for peasants for a little while because there were far fewer peasants. And because there were fewer laborers, they were more in demand, and therefore the conditions under which they labored were eased somewhat because they were needed and there were fewer of them than before. But now that the population had begun to recover and inflation was on the rise, the nobles were beginning to kind of crack down and to try to extract more from their peasant population. So in addition to increasing the rent or decreasing the amount of land that a peasant would be trying to extract crops from to survive, they also were trying to do things like revive old taxes on ridiculous things like marriage or death. So if you got married, especially if you got married to a peasant from a different estate, you need to pay a tax on that to your noble landlord. If you died, if you were a peasant laborer as a man and you died, then there was a thing called a heriot or a death tax, which meant that the nobleman would come and collect either your best animal from your own herd of farm animals as a peasant, or your best garment, and he would just come by and confiscate that because you died. Now, you can imagine how this went down with the widowed wife of the peasant farmer and his children, who were now left in a very perilous situation without their main economic engine, the man who was extracting food from the land that was going to feed them. So they've just lost their breadwinner. And now their landlord is coming by to scoop off the best of their assets that they might need to sell in this very difficult period to prevent themselves from starving. So this death tax was extremely unpopular. And even though it had existed, a century and a half before, it had lapsed because conditions had gotten better for peasants in the recovery from the Black Death. But now, in the early 1500s, nobles are putting the squeeze on them, and they're reinstating these old practices. And for the average peasant family, this didn't feel like a return to something they had known before. For them, this was just a new intrusion. This was a new burden that was being laid on them. Just because 2 generations ago it had happened to somebody else, it wasn't something that, they would have remembered and said, oh yes, this is totally acceptable and fair because, we remember great-grandfather saying he had to do this. That's not how it worked. So they just saw this as yet more burden being laid on them. A second factor was the fact that people were aware of these less burdensome living arrangements that were becoming available in the new cities that certain noblemen were opening up. And so the fact that these other ways of living were possible increased the resentment of peasant families who weren't living in that situation and who therefore were finding their own increasingly heavy burdens even more intolerable. Thirdly, there were examples of peasants beginning to push back against the pressures that were being exerted on them by these nobles and landlords, and actually succeeding in winning some concessions and in decreasing some of the arbitrary burdens that were being placed on them. So to explain this, I have to give you a little bit more information about some of the politics in what is now Germany at this time. The Swabian League was a military alliance of princes, knights, and imperial cities, these newly formed cities we've been talking about. And it was a defensive alliance that had formed in the late 1400s with the blessing of the Holy Roman Emperor, who was the monarch in charge of what we now call Germany and many other lands around it. It was part of the Holy Roman Empire. So he was the highest ranking noble of them all. He was sort of at the peak of the feudal pyramid, if you like. And then there were all these sub-nobles with their domains and duchies and kingdoms held under his authority. So he's authorized the formation of this Swabian League as a defensive alliance so that there is more local support, that nobles and neighboring duchies and estates who are members of this league can band together and raise armies to support themselves militarily from incursions nearby, as opposed to having to go to a farther away, more centralized source of authority. So that's what the Swabian League is, okay? It's princes, who are noble landlords, knights, who are fighters, and imperial cities. So one of the things that's begun to happen is that peasants have begun to band together and approach the league, the Swabian League, to mediate grievances they have with their local noble landlord. This was because the Swabian League, in addition to maintaining an army of more than 11,000 fighters, which could be called up when the members had voted on it, they also had a council. And this council had representatives from each of the member groups, the princes, the knights, and the imperial cities. And the council was involved in administration and making decisions about what the league was going to do. And so we see this trend that begins where peasants approach the council of the Swabian League to say, we have a grievance with our noble who's a member of the league. He's making completely unfair, unjust demands. And in this way, they were sort of going over the head of their noble lord to a group of his peers who were in a position to comment on whether what he was doing seemed legitimate or fair. So one question that you might be asking at this point is, why would the Swabian League give ear to peasants in the first place? And it's a great question. One of the reasons is that while all the members of the league were part of an agreement where they would contribute fighting men to whatever causes the council voted as worthy, this was expensive, and they were reluctant to do this. So they were always looking for ways to sort of find another solution that didn't involve beating the war drum and dragging out all the knights and the horses and the armor and the provisioning and the logistics that would be required to put a group of fighting men into the field. It's not cheap to do that. So if you had a nobleman who had peasants that were unhappy with him, typically that nobleman was going to be making a request for military assistance from his fellow members in the Swabian League to repress his rebellious peasants. And the Swabian League is reluctant to be sending people in to fight if they can avoid it. So when you have peasants that begin to approach the Swabian League and say, we have a grievance with this noble lord who's a member of your league, the council had an incentive to mediate and find a peaceful solution, because that would involve avoiding having to pay the bills and, round up other members and get them to contribute the men and horses that they, were standardly on the hook for as part of the membership. So we see several examples of the Swabian League Council mediating between noble lords and their peasants, and typically they would come in and they would say, well, peasants, you're out of line because you owe an oath of obedience to your lord, so you shouldn't actually be going above his head, but some of the things you've said here seem fair. So they would require concessions on both sides. They would require the peasants to sort of reaffirm their oaths of loyalty and obedience to their lord, which is a little bit humiliating. But on the flip side, they would also usually get that lord to back down on some of the more egregious things that he'd been doing. And so the peasants were fairly content with ritually, saying, yes, we're so wrong, we are obedient, we are loyal, if in exchange for that, they could get some of their demands actually written down and enforced so that the Lord couldn't just do whatever he wanted. And so there had been several examples of this kind of campaigning successfully happening, and word spread. So other peasants, in addition to the two factors we've already seen, right? They're resentful about rising taxes and additional economic burdens from their landlords. They're aware of other new cities where people have a better deal. And then they're also aware of peasants like themselves who've successfully managed to push back against abusive landlords by appeals to the Swabian League. So all of these factors so far are contributing into an environment where peasants are more upset about what's going on in their circumstances, and also they are beginning to see ways that they might push back against those things. But we haven't got to the fourth and perhaps the most significant factor. The fourth factor that contributes to our story is that there were revolutionary ideas in the air at this time. And those ideas came directly from Martin Luther, who was living in the same territory that we now call Germany, and whose words were spreading with incredible speed across the landscape. So it wasn't just intellectuals and churchmen and bishops and nobles who were familiar with what Martin Luther had been saying. His ideas were being disseminated to everyday people. They were being disseminated in sort of pamphlets with comical and often quite ridiculous illustrations. And they were also being distributed by word of mouth. So people who couldn't read would be hearing about Luther's ideas because they were traveling preachers or followers of Luther who were going up and down the landscape preaching what he'd been saying to everyday people, including these peasant farmers. So, what had Luther been saying that is so significant? It began in 1517, when Martin Luther famously publishes his 95 Theses in the city of Wittenberg. And this document is famous because Luther goes after what he sees as exploitative practices of the institutional church of his day. And he famously attacks the sale of indulgences, which, if you want to hear more about that, I recommend you listen to the Luther episode. But briefly, indulgences were kind of an additional tax that the church institutions had been trying to push on the peasants at this very same period that they were under more pressure from their noble landlords and so on. So Luther reacts to this and he says, this is abusive. This is ridiculous. It's got nothing to do with religion. You're taking advantage of the ignorance and the emotions of these poor farmers to extract even more money from them. And then he goes further and he says there are really serious problems with the institutional church of his day. The Pope is responsible for sanctioning practices that are actually corrupt and harmful to the members of the church, like these everyday peasants. In 1520, only 3 years later, Luther writes a document called Address to the Nobles of a Christian Nation, and it's addressed, of course, to the nobles in Germany, where he says, the Pope is not the only one who's able to interpret Christianity, actually. And this is a radical claim, okay? No one had said this in recent memory, and the people who dared to suggest such things usually ended up burning alive at a stake. So it was a very dangerous thing to come out and say. It was a direct challenge to the established church hierarchy of his day. And Luther says, everyday people can interpret Christianity for themselves. All they need is a copy of the Bible in their own language that they can read. And if they have that, they can read that text, they can understand what Christianity means, and they can apply it to their own lives. They do not require a pope to dictate doctrine to them. They don't need bishops and priests to tell them, what it means. Ordinary people can do it themselves. And Luther calls this the priesthood of all believers, in which he makes the radical claim that everybody is spiritually equal. In other words, you don't have greater moral value or spiritual status because you happen to be a priest or even because you're the Pope. That your spiritual status or your moral standing is not determined by your job description or by where in the hierarchy you are placed. Luther said, and I quote, "From all this it follows that there is really no difference between laymen," he means ordinary people here, "and priests, princes, and bishops, spirituals and temporals, as they call them, except that of office and work, for they are all of the same estate. A cobbler, a smith, a farmer, each has the work and office of his trade, and yet they are all alike consecrated priests and bishops." So he's really saying here, we have no need for the hierarchies and the officials of the church. When it comes to religion, everybody has the same spiritual standing. This is wild. These writings were nothing less than a frontal assault on the institutional church, which was one of the twin pillars of Luther's society. There was the church, with the Pope at its apex, and there was the state, with the king or the Holy Roman Emperor at the top of that pyramid. And these two together had their own law courts, their own systems of taxation, their own officials. They were twin pillars, and Luther's basically taking an axe to one of them completely. Scripture, not church authority, argued Luther, should be our only guide to what is the will of God and the only measure of morality and religion. Finally, in June of 1524, just before the peasant uprisings began, Luther publishes another document called On Trade and Usury, which means money lending, in which he decries the greedy, profit-motivated practices that made trade, in his view, the way he was observing it in his neighborhood at the time, nothing less than the robbing and stealing of other people's property. So again, Luther's ideas are spreading far and wide, especially in what is now Germany. There's a whole army of people who are taking what he writes and reproducing it on printing presses and disseminating it in pamphlets and handing it out, and you have lay preachers, meaning not priests or friars, official members of the clergy, but everyday people who've picked up Luther's ideas and are traveling around the country, repeating them and spreading the message to others. With all these factors converging, many peasants felt not only that their situation was intolerable, but that they now had the justification and the strategies to push back against their oppressors. Martin Luther had provided the justification because he had said that essentially everybody was equal, that nobody had more moral superiority just because of their position in the social hierarchy. So if that was true, why should nobles and priests be allowed to burden them so heavily? And they had methods and mechanisms for pushing back because now they could appeal to the Swabian League. They could send emissaries to that council and get the League to mediate against oppressive nobles and force them to make concessions. So these conditions provided the perfect groundwork for the large-scale rebellion that begins to develop. So this rebellion, which will eventually be called the Peasants' War, that lasts from 1524 to 1525, was immediately preceded in the decade or two earlier by a bunch of smaller revolts and uprisings, sometimes called the Bundschuh movement. And this Bundschuh word refers to a traditional laced shoe that was worn by peasants. And so in these scenarios, you'd had smaller groups of peasants, much more localized, rebelling against their landlords and refusing to pay or refusing to provide the services that they were accustomed to giving. Since the beginning of the 1500s, these small localized revolts had dramatically and continuously increased in number, which suggests that in just the 20 years prior to this massive rebellion, there'd been a dramatic uptick in peasants pushing back and probably in the levels of poverty and desperation that would motivate them to take such drastic actions. And I say drastic actions because it was routine for nobles to crush peasant rebellions with violence. So you had to be pretty desperate to decide that you were going to refuse to pay or to refuse to work for your local count because he might send a bunch of knights in and burn your village. So the results of this could be really quite terrifying. So the fact that we see an increasing number of these in the 20 years prior means that a lot of people were really at the end of their rope, so to speak, and that they felt that conditions were so bad that they had little choice but to risk violent reprisals in the hope of achieving some kind of concession or improvement in their situation. In 1522, an enemy of Martin Luther, and he had quite a number of them, wrote a pamphlet claiming that Luther's teachings were directly giving fuel to these Bundschuh peasant rebellions. And so the cover of this pamphlet is illustrated with a drawing that basically shows an armor-clad Luther kneeling to clean a peasant's laced-up shoe. And the message is very, very clear. And the illustration is titled Greasing the Bundschuh. So this man had put into words something that a lot of people saw, which was a connection between the things that Luther had been saying and the direct action that peasants were taking to push back against their conditions. Also, as a direct result of Luther's teachings, some districts in Germany had begun refusing to pay their tithes. So this is not the tax to the noble lord, this is the tax to the church. And there were peasants who refused to do this, but knights and nobles as well, who were saying, well, if Luther's correct, and our institutional church is corrupt and abusive, and we don't actually need them to be good Christians and understand the will of God, then why are we paying them all this money? And so this tithe refusal had also begun directly in the wake of what Luther was saying, and it was very popular amongst peasants, but also amongst knights and nobles who, in addition to keeping their tithes for themselves, were anxious to reappropriate church property that was sort of on or near their estates. So the farm of that monastery that's sitting next to my estate is looking very attractive. If I, as a noble lord, decide that the church is corrupt, I can appropriate this monastery and this prime arable land for myself, and that makes me richer. So you can see that, there might have been ideological reasons, but there were also very practical economic ones as well. So Luther's ideas are being traced in many directions as having a direct effect on how people are behaving in terms of refusal to labor, refusal to pay taxes to their lords, and refusal to pay tithes to the church. The events of the Peasant War finally begin in the fall of 1524 in the Black Forest region of what is now Germany, before spreading both south and north to eventually engulf most of that country. By one account, they started during the harvest in 1524 on a large estate in Stühlingen, which is on the border between Germany and Switzerland. Countess von Lupfen demanded that the serfs, who were at that time harvesting the crops from the fields all over the estate, immediately cease what they were doing. She had a different job for them. She said that everyone should go to work immediately gathering snail shells. Why snail shells? Well, because apparently they were popular for the Countess and her friends and her ladies to wind their wool around. So they were basically functioning as bobbins or thread holders. So she decides, that's it, everyone out of the fields, you're all going on a snail shell hunt today. Well, this didn't go over very well for the peasants working her land, because of course the rent was still going to be due. the harvest still had to be gathered in. This wasn't a holiday from doing what they were obligated to do. They needed to bring those crops in to give them to the nobles who owned the property, and also they needed to harvest the crops off of the very small portion of land that they got to live on so that they could feed their families. So this forced diversion of the necessary work of harvesting for a snail shell expedition was incredibly resented because it just meant they were going to have to spend even more time later trying to catch up with this work that they weren't now going to be doing while they were hunting for snails. Now, this snail shell hunt has been frequently repeated. It's sort of given as the traditional starting point. Whether it's precisely accurate or not doesn't really matter. It's a good illustration of the arbitrariness that most serfs lived under. The fact that their noble landlords could at any time tell them, okay, you're doing this now. It's extra, but I'm diverting everyone for this day to do this other thing. Yes, you still have to do all that other work, but now you're going to be working overtime, essentially. Are you getting paid any more for that? Definitely not. So being sort of a victim to the whimsical demands of these aristocrats was not particular to the peasants in Stulingen. It was something that everyone had to put up with. And so this episode illustrates exactly the sort of thing that would have incensed people who were already under an enormous amount of economic pressure to begin with. As a result, refusals to provide payment or labor, depending on the conditions of the rent, happened in a number of estates that autumn. And they weren't just limited to the estates owned by nobles. Monasteries and churchmen were also landlords. So the abbot of a monastery could be your landlord. And if you were a peasant working on that estate, the abbot who was in charge of the monastery was your landlord. So there were peasants who were refusing to pay rent to their landlords, whether they were churchmen or nobles. And this began to break out in that district in Germany in the autumn of 1524, and it began to spread. Reports say that during Shrovetide, which is a 4-day festival preceding Lent, and this usually falls in February or March because it's connected to Easter, which is a rotating date. So Shrovetide, we have to think of it as being late February, early March. It's this 4-day festival. Peasants begin to travel from one village to another to mobilize, to spread the word about refusal to pay in labor or rent. Now, they have some air cover for this, if you like. You couldn't normally just leave your fields or leave your labor and go wandering off, walking to another village because you felt like it. But the reason why they could do this during Shrovetide was that it was a holiday. It was one of the few times in the year when peasants had days off from their standard labor, and it was customary to go and visit friends and family in other estates or other villages or districts, and to eat Shrovetide cakes. So this was sort of common enough to be traversing the countryside at this time, leaving your own farms and your own noble estate to go elsewhere. So some peasants are using this as an excuse to visit not for social reasons, but for economic organization reasons, to spread the word and to recruit other peasants to their cause, to encourage groups of farmers in other districts to also refuse to go back to work or to pay their rent in grain. But if they were questioned, these peasant organizers claimed, we're just going on a Shrovetide visit, we're just going to go eat some cakes in the neighboring village. But in fact, they were very successful in recruiting increasing numbers of peasants from one village who would accompany them to the next and the next, so that by the end of February, there are reports saying that the peasants who had been recruited numbered some 30,000. That's an astonishing number of people in a very short amount of time. In many places, the revolt started with a labor strike. Peasants would simply refuse to go to work that day, and then in their villages they would ring the storm bell, a bell that was normally rung when bad weather was coming in, or when there was some other reason for alarm. So in this case, they would ring the bell, and that was a signal for the heads of households, the men, to go meet together in some central location, usually under a tree, and to discuss what they were going to do, what they were going to do with this labor strike, and the fact that no one was going to work that day or the day after or the day after that. Rallies soon ensued, where striking groups of peasants from one estate, because they weren't going to work in their lord's fields, would now travel to other estates and meet groups of striking peasants there, and they would begin to conglomerate or join together. And as these groups grew in size, they would have sort of shared objectives, and they would make oaths of mutual support and brotherhood. So if you guys get into trouble and your lord is sending people to harass you or intimidate you, we'll come and help you, and you'll also come and help us, and we're going to stand together to support our mutual interests in this moment. It's best to understand this uprising as roving bands of peasants from different districts. So it wasn't sort of one massive unified front. It was a word of a labor strike that starts in one area and spreads out, and pretty soon people in more distant areas who hear about it sort of organize their own echo of that strike, and they reach out to other villages and peasants in their district. So it's sort of a synchronized, sympathetic series of labor strikes that are happening, as opposed to sort of one centralized meeting point. That's not what happens. But as word travels, we get these sort of copycat or similar actions that break out in many districts across what is now Germany. And the reason that these peasant bands from different districts are joining together is that numbers are their best protection from the violent suppression, which is the usual response of landlords when peasants refuse to do what they're told. It's also important to understand that these groups are composed of people with different agendas. Some of them are wealthier farmers, even farmers who come from some of the new cities. And so they are not under such economic pressure. They're doing better under the system that is, but they're joining a labor strike in the hopes of extracting more concessions or an improvement in their conditions. Others are hard-pressed serfs who are living in desperate poverty and have very little to lose. And so they're joining this movement because they feel they have no other options. And still others will be, former soldiers and farmers and peasants who have personal grievances, sort of long-standing gripes with their local landlord. And so they also are looking for a reason to push back. So it's not as though everyone has exactly the same economic conditions or exactly the same set of demands, but it's a coalition that begins to form in different districts of people who see this as an opportunity, for various reasons of their own, to try and improve their conditions. As more of these groups form in an increasing number of districts, we see larger and larger agglomerations. You can think of them as sort of small groups that join together into a bigger blob, which then moves over and joins to another bigger blob, and you get a much, much larger cloud-like shape. You can visualize it this way. As these peasant bands swelled in numbers and traveled across the countryside, they began to support these new cities, these newly formed imperial cities, and ask them for support. Now remember, the imperial cities are members of the Swabian League. The Swabian League is composed of princes, knights, and imperial cities. So when peasants are approaching these cities, they're approaching cities that are members of that league and therefore have standing in terms of voting on what the league does, but are also full of people who are potentially sympathizers, because the cities are not full of nobles. They're full of merchants and artisans and farmers and people very much like the rebels. And so they're sort of natural allies in many ways. And so it's unsurprising that these recruiting newly formed bands of peasants approach them and they say, will you support us? Also, will you sell us the things that we need? Because we're going to be needing things like pikes and gunpowder and so on, and we need to purchase these things. So cities are increasingly approached by these bands of mobilized and armed peasants and asked, where do you stand? Now, this kind of request puts cities in a very difficult and awkward position. Because remember, all these cities exist on land that is owned by a nobleman, to whom they pay an annual rent, and they have an agreement with him that allows them to exist. So to support a peasant rebellion is an act of rebellion for that city against its own landlord, which is awkward. However, significant percentages of the population of these cities were increasingly poor. We have some historical records that show that in some of these cities, based on the tax registers, up to 50% of the population was impoverished. And so those people were natural sympathizers with the rebels. And so if the city council, which was typically formed, as it usually is, of wealthy city members, wealthy burghers who had enough money that they could spend time attending council meetings and making decisions, if the wealthy city council was going to refuse the request of the peasant rebels, they risked being unseated by their own population. Because if enough of the poor population of the city wanted to support the rebel peasants, but the city council said no, these city councilors could find themselves tossed out by their own population. So they didn't want that. But if the wealthy city councilors said, okay, we're worried about our population, we don't want to be disloyal to our landlord, let's send word to the Swabian Council, because the cities are members of that council, and ask for military support, or even support from the noble lord whose land they occupied, the city risks losing its independence. If the city council seems like they can't control their own population and they need to call in support from an external source, then they may risk their independence altogether and just be sitting under direct rule of that nobleman. So the city councils were in this very precarious situation of losing control either by being dominated from the top or unseated from the bottom. And as a result of this, many of them decide to try and adopt this position of careful neutrality, where they say, well, you know, we're not going to stand against you, peasant rebels. We can't openly support you. We're going to remain officially neutral. This was a line that a lot of them tried to walk. And as members of the Swabian Council, these cities would have tried to support a more peaceful resolution to the rebels' demands. They would have said, you know, as members of the council, we think that the Swabian League should do X or Y, should intervene to find some sort of non-violent way of resolving these concerns. And when I say that we're talking about peasant rebels here, it's important to remember that at the moment, this is just a labor strike. These are peasants who are just refusing to go to work in the fields or refusing to pay their rent. And they're not doing this indefinitely. They're saying, we're withholding these things until our demands are met or until our concerns are dealt with. So it's essentially an organized, massive labor strike that's going on. But the reason why the peasants are armed is because they're very much aware that at any time they could be facing violent suppression. And so they're adopting a defensive posture, but no blows have yet been struck in these early days of February and March 1524. And as the peasants are organizing in ever larger numbers, they decide to come up with something like a manifesto, and they call it their 12 articles. And so what happens is, this is sort of it's a summary of more than 300 separate articles or demands that have been compiled by different groups of organized peasants across Germany that are beginning to communicate with each other and to bond together with these agreements of mutual support. So in the last 4 days, between February 27th and March the 1st, a couple of individuals, men, are given the unenviable task of sifting through these more than 300 separate demands and trying to come up with one succinct, shorter, unifying document that everyone can sort of stand behind. And that's what these 12 articles are. The document was compiled by a man named Sebastian Lotzer, who is described as a furrier and lay preacher, which means he was exactly one of these guys who was walking up and down the countryside spreading the words of Martin Luther. He's not a priest, he's not a friar, he's an everyday guy. That's what a lay preacher means. But he's taken it upon himself to spread the good word, by which we mean the words of Martin Luther. There's a preamble written to this 12-article document, written by another lay preacher by the name of Christoph Schapler. Now, the purpose of this document was to compile the main demands of all the peasants who were in revolt so that they could be presented to the Swabian League in the hope that the League would mediate for the peasants with their landlords and achieve some kind of settlement that would resolve the matter. The articles themselves give a very good idea of exactly what was driving this revolt, but they're also very revealing of just how much Martin Luther's ideas were embedded in the minds of these everyday people. So I'm going to tell you what they are. The very first article in the document called The 12 Articles of the Christian Union of Upper Swabia. Let's stop. The peasants are referring to themselves as a Christian union, first of all. So religious language is part of the headline of the document we're reading. Number 1, they demand the right to appoint their own pastor and to depose him if he conducts himself improperly. He must teach the gospel pure and simple, quote unquote, that last line. So what this is a rebellion against their local priests and abbots and bishops, the officials of the institutional church at the time, which was the Roman Catholic Church. These peasants are saying, we want to have reformed pastors in our communities that we can select, and if they misbehave, we want to be able to kick them out. So we're not going to be sitting under the thumb of somebody who's been set up over us as a church official, and we want this guy to be a reformer. The second article refers to tithing. Now, tithing is that 10% tax that you owe the church. And the peasants are saying, we agree to pay a tithe to support the pastor that we choose, and any part of the tithe that is more than what is needed for the economic support and maintenance of that pastor should be returned to the community to support the poor among us. Now, this is significant because in most communities, the tithe was actually owned by a church institution or an official, such as a monastery. And what would happen would be the village would render up its tithes to the monastery in the tithe barn. The monastery would take a percentage of that tithe to pay the village priest. But the rest of it, which was more than what the priest would need, the monastery would keep. It would go back into the coffers of the institutional church. So the community never saw that. So article number 2 is saying, we don't want to pay to the church more than what is needed for the support of the pastor who serves us. Anything extra, we're going to pay it, but it should go to support those hungry and destitute families in our community. Article number 3, they request release from serfdom as true Christians. They say that we should not be held and treated as property. And the article says that because Christ died for all, quote, the lowliest shepherd as well as the greatest Lord, unquote, it was improper for people to be treated like property. So this article is referring to serfdom. It's referring to the medieval tradition of peasants being tied to the land, of owing an oath of allegiance to their noble lord, and being completely subject to his whims and his demands, whatever they might be. It's not talking about the sort of new cities and new rent that are on the rise. This is about traditional serfdom, which is how most people lived. And they were saying, we ought not to be treated as property because we're all Christians and we're all equal in the sight of God. Article number 4, they want the ability to fish and to kill wild animals in the common land or on the estate around where they are farming. And this was something that they'd been heavily punished for doing in the past. And in particular, when wild animals were destroying the crops that they had to pay rent out of or feed their families from. Article 5. They wanted access to firewood in the forests on the estate, and not to be required to pay for that firewood because it was the property of the Lord. And, I mean, this may seem like a trivial thing to you or me, but remember, there's no central heating. To avoid freezing in the wintertime, the only thing you can do is to gather firewood and to burn it inside your house to keep you and your family warm. And so if you have to pay for firewood, which you still have to go gather yourself, but now you have to, pay a tax for collecting that, that increases your burden because it's not an optional thing. It's not like you can just decide, well, I don't feel like paying for firewood, so I'm not going to gather any. Then you freeze. So they were tired of being taxed for this completely essential thing that they had to have. Article 6 is a demand that nobles stop increasing the services demanded of us, which are now excessive and oppressive. Quote, since our forefathers were only required to serve according to the word of God, unquote. So this is an interesting demand because it's referencing the fact that there's been an increase in demands that are being made for labor and services by these landlords. But the other interesting thing is that they're referring to the Bible. They're using the Bible explicitly as justification for this demand. When they say the word of God, they're talking about scripture. And we're going to see that referred to throughout this document. But more on that later. Item 7. Lords should stop exacting further services beyond existing agreements with their peasants for no payment. So if you want us to work overtime, you want us to work extra, you should pay us. That was how radical that demand was. Item 8. Rents to be paid should be supportable by the land they are attached to, and not beyond what can reasonably be produced on that land. Peasants are burdened by, quote, holdings which cannot support the rent exacted from them, unquote. So basically this is the practice of a nobleman saying, I'm going to give you a really small field, but I want you to pay me a pretty high rate of grain or fruit or whatever out of this. And these peasants are saying, well, there's so little land here. How can we pay everything you've asked us to pay as well as keep ourselves from starving? The land is too little to extract the amount of product that you're demanding from us. Item number 9. Peasants should be judged according to old written laws and not receive arbitrary punishments under constantly invented new laws. So this is the idea that peasants were very much subject to the whims of their lords, and that for the same offense, on one day, one peasant might get a very mild reproof and another one might have his ears removed, depending on how that lord was feeling that day. And so there was no sense of certainty about what the consequence would be, or whether an action that had been okay on one day would now be prohibited the following month. Item 10. Stop appropriation of meadows and fields, which were common land. So this is the idea of kind of a creeping land grab by the landlord. Areas that peasants were able to kind of allow their animals to graze or forage are now increasingly being denied to them, and then they have to pay taxes to use those things, so it increases the burden that they are under. Item 11, an end to the heriot or death tax, which robs widows and orphans. And item 12, if any article herein be proved to be not in agreement with the word of God, we shall retract it. But if more complaints be discovered, which are based on truth and scriptures, we will add them. So what's really interesting about this document is that it really has Martin Luther's fingerprints all over it. And that begins with this reference to the Bible as the justification for everything that they're doing. They're basically saying the conditions we live under are unchristian. And when we say they're unchristian, it's not because Christian nobles and a Christian nation haven't been doing it for centuries, but because it doesn't line up with the Bible as we read it. Now, this may sound not so unfamiliar to you or I if you've grown up in a Protestant or post-Protestant nation, but at the time it was a radical assertion. I mean, the idea that a common person could just say, "It's not in the Bible, therefore it's wrong," didn't exist 15 years prior to this moment. Didn't exist. So for these everyday people to say, we know what is right, and we know it because the Bible says this, and therefore what you are doing is not right, even though you might be a nobleman, even though you might be the abbot or the head of a monastery and a member of the institutional church and a landlord, what you're doing is fundamentally wrong, and it needs to stop because it's unjust and it's against Scripture. The person who had opened that door and made it possible for an ordinary person to just hold up the Bible and say, "This is what God says," was Martin Luther. That was his his motto. It was by Scripture alone, by faith alone, and hierarchies and traditions and institutions didn't matter. That Martin Luther had stood alone holding the text and said, "This is what Scripture says as I understand it, therefore all of these conclusions follow," and justified an overhaul of the entire institutional church of his day. And so these everyday people who have heard what Luther has said have taken him at his word and said, "Exactly so. We're also reading the Bible, and what we see there is directly in contradiction to the conditions we live under. Therefore, those conditions need to change." Never mind that this has been going on for centuries. So this is a radical, revolutionary idea, and it can be traced directly to Martin Luther's thinking and writing. Fundamentally, these rebels are saying there is a higher authority than our noble landlords and the princes of the church and even the Pope himself. And that higher authority is God, and we can know what God wants based on what's in the Bible. And so holding up this standard, everyone is accountable to that. All of us are equally under that standard. And so they're now asking people who've had power for as long as anybody can remember to be accountable to that. It's an incredible moment. Now, the peasants took this document, which, remember, was penned by traveling reformist preachers. So once again, even the guys who are actually moving the pens across the paper are fundamentally embedded in the Protestant Reformation. They're direct agents of spreading its ideas and of embedding those ideas throughout the text. But the text is taken to the Swabian League as a way of presenting the rebels' cause and appealing for mediation. And basically nothing happens. The Swabian League drags its heels. They don't really commit to mediation. They don't give any kind of a definitive answer. Some historians have claimed cynically that they're just dragging their heels as a play to kind of keep the peasants waiting while they're secretly mobilizing their members to get their armies organized. But other historians say, no, this is consistent with a pattern of the Swabian League being involved in other such scenarios where they're sort of considering the request and they're going to figure out some kind of procedure, that we don't have reason to believe that they were absolutely cynical about it from the point that this was received. Certainly there would have been members of the council who were angry nobles who said, "These insolent peasants need to be taught a lesson. You know, we absolutely need to make an example of some of them, butcher a few of them, and, you know, put everyone back into line." There definitely were members, noblemen, who were saying that, but it wasn't at all a unanimous thing. And remember, there are imperial cities and others that are part of this group. So at first, nothing happens. Whether that's innocent or whether it's malicious, we can't know. Meanwhile, in early March, which is only a few days later, 3 of the largest peasant organizing groups get together and issue another document called the Federal Ordinance. And basically, this is a statement of intention that suggests a confederation of peasants that could reach even as far as Switzerland. So they're expanding this movement, they're trying to increase the ties of mutual support, and basically suggest a reshaping of economics in a very, very large amount of territory. So this document, this federal ordinance, proposed, amongst other things, a boycott by all its members of any castle or monastery that refused to recognize the 12 articles. So they were saying, we should be united in this. We should all agree together that if any castle or monastery refuses to recognize our manifesto, we're going to withhold all personal contact, all labor, we won't pay, we won't sell, we won't be involved. So we're basically going to cut them off. It's going to be a complete strike, and we're going to be united in supporting each other so that if this nobleman can't get labor from some of us, he's not going to be able to find it anywhere else. It's going to ensure that the pressure remains even and that these institutions and powerful aristocrats are forced to recognize our demands. This confederation was also heavily influenced by Reformation ideas, and it aimed to, quote, call upon the Holy Gospel and the Word of God to protect justice and the divine law. So again, there's a very clear invocation of the Bible as the measure of what is just and of the way that laws and things should be shaped. And in order to determine what that divine law would be, they actually proposed in this document 4 pious arbitrators that they wanted to employ to sort of be in charge of determining what divine law should look like or how local laws should reflect the will of God. And this list of arbitrators reads like a who's who of the Reformation. They list Martin Luther as one of the guys they want in charge of doing this job, along with Philip Melanchthon, who was one of Luther's major collaborators, and Ulrich Zwingli, another notable reformer, amongst others. So they're actually doing a name call of some of the most influential reformers that exist, and they want them to be in charge of this economic revolution. Now, as we shall see, Martin Luther became very anxious to distance himself from this revolt. He wants nothing to do with it. But it was like an unwanted child that nevertheless bore his very distinctive features. The gripes the peasants had about their economic conditions weren't new, but Reformation ideas were, and those gave them the justification to begin the largest popular revolt that had ever been seen prior to the French Revolution. By March 21st, we're now in the spring of 1525. This is 3 or 4 weeks after the 12 articles have been drafted, and maybe 2 weeks after the federal ordinance has been proposed. We see increasingly large groups of peasants marching around a town with a drum, spreading to other villages, and mobilizing for rebellion. The peasants form a committee of 36 as a central organizing force for the many disparate groups in different regions that are now involved and communicating with each other. The following week, several town councils are pressured into supporting these peasant rebels. And there's a report of one town council that really didn't have much of a choice. There's a source from the period that reports that one town council was sort of trapped by these peasant rebels that showed up in town, sat them down as they were in their meeting, and called them in one at a time, each of the councillors, and demanded if they were going to support the rebellion or not. And these wealthy council members were absolutely terrified. As they were called up one by one, each of them thought that they were sort of going to be called in and killed. So they were absolutely terrified. And it was a one-way trip. The counselor would come from the meeting room into the room where he was going to meet these rebel organizers and then go out the other door. So the guys in the first room didn't know if the man who'd preceded them was alive or dead by the time their turn came. So it just increased the level of terror that they felt during this interview. And of course, unsurprisingly, all the counselors said, oh yes, yes, we'll support the rebellion. And they were then allowed to leave through the other door. So in this way, the rebels got the unanimous approval of the entire council in this particular town. Now we begin to see the rebellion shift a little bit. Its demands have been put down in writing. They've been submitted to the Swabian League. Enough peasants are now involved in this confederation, and they're going and they're putting pressure on these different towns. So very soon, local priests begin to be harassed by mobs of peasants who are part of this rebellion. And this is because, remember, priests are part of the institutional Roman Catholic Church, which is very much seen as the enemy by Martin Luther and people who are influenced by these reform ideas. And many of those people are the peasants in this rebellion. So they see that local priest as part of a corrupt and abusive system. So unsurprisingly, these priests are told, that's it, you can't say mass anymore, get out, or go to work in the fields like a regular person. We're all equals here, and you don't have any special status. By early April, there are reports of a peasant force numbering approximately some 2,000 people, and they gather near a place called Neussitz. And on Good Friday, a very, very important service in the Christian calendar, in Rothenburg, which is a town, a regular church service is suspended, the priest is kicked out, and only a reformer, so someone who's part of the Martin Luther Revolution, this reformer by the name of Dr. John Tuchel, was allowed to give a sermon in the church that day. And in this sermon, he rails against emperors, kings, princes, and lords, ecclesiastical and lay, so churchmen and nobles, on the grounds that they are hindering God's word. So once again, we see that while this is an economic strike, it's also a religious revolt, and it's heavily embedded with the ideas of Martin Luther. So as this rebellion spreads, as it picks up momentum, we see these armed and mobilized bands of peasants not just interfering with church services, but actually occupying monasteries and castles in their districts. So physically taking over these structures, kicking out monks or abbots who'd been inhabiting that monastery, helping themselves to what was in the larder, sometimes plundering, taking out grain from the tithe barn, helping themselves to food or wine that is stored in these larders, and occupying sometimes even castles of noblemen. But again, this is not one unified army progressing in an organized way across the landscape. It's large bands of organized peasants that are primarily focused on the nobles and the monasteries in their districts. So they'll be active doing these kinds of activities in the areas near where they live, even though they're in communication with other bands in other areas. Now you might be wondering, how is it that these peasants are occupying castles? I mean, how is all this happening so quickly? And the answer is that part of the speed and the success of this revolt was enabled by the fact that most of the fighting men, most of the trained soldiers were occupied elsewhere. They were fighting other battles in other parts of Europe, such as Italy, because what is now modern Germany is at this time part of the Holy Roman Empire, which is a much, much larger bunch of territories, and its ruler, the Holy Roman Emperor, has lots of geopolitical concerns in very far-flung places. And so a lot of the fighting men who would normally be local to this region are deployed elsewhere, and that leaves the landscape pretty open and vulnerable to large bands of armed men, even if they are only farmers. And so that's the reason why they're able to successfully occupy, particularly castles owned by noblemen in some cases. One of the most radical peasant organizers was a preacher by the name of Thomas Müntzer. So he's again someone who began as a person heavily influenced by Martin Luther's ideas, but is taking them to places that Martin Luther is not comfortable going yet. And Munzer is very much involved in this rebellion, and he's embedded in a group of peasants that take over a town of Mulhausen. And when they occupy that town, they kick out the town council, which is, as usual, composed of wealthy burghers or town members. And they decide to start communicating from there and broadcasting their demands to the local noble landlord. Now Thomas Munzer was tired of just appealing to the nobles to be better, so he wrote to the local count, the local aristocrat, in the following words. Brother Ernest, which was the count's name, Brother Ernest, just tell us, you miserable, wretched sack of worms, who made you a prince over the people whom God redeemed with his dear blood? You shall and will have to prove that you are a Christian. So you can see here that there's a distinct lack of deference in the way that Thomas Munzer is writing, but this demand and this level of disgust is also laced with an appeal to what being a Christian really means. And Munzer is saying, what you're doing as a count and a nobleman is inconsistent with the behavior that is required of a Christian. And so we are holding you to accountability with this higher moral standard that even you have to be subject to. And as these more aggressive peasant bands are spreading out, other nobles are being pressured to enter into, quote, a Christian covenant with these striking peasants. And this is, again, an intensely religious set of demands. So the word covenant is a biblical word, and it goes all the way back to the Old Testament. It is one of the most, not one of the most, it is the most serious kind of oath or pact or agreement that you can make. So for reference, God is supposed to have made a covenant with Abraham. And that's this agreement that's going to last for generations. And so God makes promises to Abraham, and Abraham makes promises to God, and the agreement is sealed with a blood sacrifice. Marriage is often referred to as a covenant. So it's a word that is associated with the most serious kind of agreement you can make, and it's usually sealed with oaths, and it's done sort of in the eyes of God. So for the rebels to be articulating their demands in this very religious way is again a reflection of the fact that they see themselves as expressing the will of God and of demanding of the nobles not just some economic concessions, but an acknowledgement of divine justice. As we shall see in our next episode, the defenders of the established order were not about to take all of this lying down. While the peasants looked to Martin Luther as their inspiration, his response to their use of his ideas would be thunderous rejection. And things are about to get very bloody indeed. You've been listening to Villains and Virgins podcast. And if you're enjoying what you're hearing here, you can consider supporting it on Patreon. There's a link for that in the description for the episode. And make sure that you like and subscribe so that you don't miss the next episode, which is a truly explosive bloodbath in this remarkable chapter in history. You can catch it anywhere you listen to audio, on Spotify, Apple, or whatever platform you prefer. And you can get the illustrated version of these episodes on YouTube. I hope I'll see you in the next chapter.